She called the sheriff to stop me from demolishing her HOA cabin, but every survey marker under her boots said she was standing on my land. The diesel engine of my excavator idled behind me, low and steady, while the bucket hovered 12 inches from the cedar siding of the cabin. Morning sunlight cut through the pine trees and flashed across the windshield of my pickup. The air smelled like damp soil, hydraulic fluid, and fresh-cut grass from somewhere beyond the ridge. Diane Whitmore stood near the gravel turnaround in a cream jacket and dark slacks, one hand gripping her phone, the other pointing toward the machine as if she could stop 12 tons of equipment by sheer authority. "Turn it off, Caleb," she said. "You do not have permission to touch HOA property." I looked past her at the orange survey flags running through the trees. 61 feet. That was how far the cabin sat inside my boundary. Not 6 inches. Not some questionable line hidden beneath an old fence. 61 feet. A county deputy stood beside Diane's white sport utility vehicle while a building inspector reviewed the paperwork I had placed on the hood of my truck. Demolition permit. Utility clearance. Environmental review. Recorded deed. Certified survey. Everything was there. Diane had brought an attorney too, a narrow man in a navy suit who kept reading the first page of the survey, as if the numbers might rearrange themselves if he stared long enough. "Residents have used this cabin for 17 years, Diane said. "The association built it. The association maintained it. You cannot just show up and erase community property." I brushed pine dust from my work gloves. I did not just show up. Her face tightened. She knew that. Everyone standing there knew it. What they did not know was how strange the whole thing had become before we reached that morning. For months earlier, I had never heard of Diane Whitmore. I had never attended a Cedar Ridge Estates board meeting. I did not care what color their mailboxes were, how tall their fences could be, or what their landscaping committee thought about anything. My name is Caleb Mercer. I am 44 years old, and I own a small excavation and grading company. I bought 38 acres outside Cedar Ridge because part of that land had once belonged to my grandfather. I wanted a workshop, room for my equipment, and enough pine trees between me and the nearest subdivision that nobody would care when I started a diesel engine before breakfast. Then I found their cabin. At first, I thought the problem would take one survey and one conversation to solve. I was wrong. It took 4 months, thousands of dollars, a title examination, old county plats, HOA meeting records, and eventually a courtroom. The strangest part was not that Diane believed Cedar Ridge owned the cabin. The strangest part was that 17 years earlier, her own HOA board had written down exactly whose land they planned to build it on. The inspector closed my permit folder and handed it back to me. "Everything is in order, Mr. Mercer." Diane stepped forward. "No, there is still an easement." I looked at her, then at the narrow trail disappearing toward the lake. "There is." She seemed relieved for half a second. "Then you admit Cedar Ridge has rights here." I never denied that. I pointed toward 2 orange flags 6 feet apart beside the trail. "Those are your rights." Then I pointed toward the cabin 61 feet inside my property. "That is not." The deputy said nothing. Diane's attorney lowered the survey. Behind us, the excavator continued its steady mechanical rumble. I climbed back into the cab, rested my hand beside the controls, and looked through the windshield at the cabin Cedar Ridge had called its own for 17 years. Before I moved that bucket the final 12 inches, I remembered the first time I had walked this property and found an old iron survey pin buried beneath pine needles, stamped with 2 characters I did not understand yet. C7. 4 months earlier, there was no excavator beside the cabin, no deputy on the gravel road, and no orange survey flags cutting through the trees. There was only me, 38 acres of quiet land, and the smell of pine needles warming under an October sun. I had closed on the property 3 days earlier. The parcel stretched along the western edge of Cedar Ridge Estates, climbing from a narrow lake through hardwood and pine before leveling out near an old logging road. My grandfather, Walter Mercer, had owned part of that ground when I was a kid. I remembered riding beside him in an old green pickup while he checked drainage ditches after summer storms. He sold most of the acreage before I finished high school, and over the years pieces changed hands until the remaining tract became one awkward block nobody seemed interested in developing. I was interested. I had spent 22 years running excavators, grading foundations, cutting access roads, and fixing drainage problems other contractors preferred to avoid. I knew what 38 acres could become. My plan was to build a 40 by 60-foot workshop near the southern end, store my equipment there, clean up the old logging road, and leave most of the northern woods untouched. No subdivision, no vacation rentals, no grand development plan. I wanted working land and a piece of my family history back. That first Saturday, I walked the perimeter carrying a printed survey, a compass, marking ribbon, and a thermos of coffee. The deed referenced several older tracts that had been combined over the years. Most were ordinary legal descriptions until I reached the northern section near the lake. There, the survey showed a narrow access easement crossing something labeled Tract C7. I had no reason to care about the designation yet. I was looking for an old boundary monument described as an iron pin near a cluster of white oaks. It took nearly 40 minutes to find it. Pine needles covered everything, and a fallen branch had settled directly across the spot. I moved the branch aside with my boot and scraped away the needles with my glove. Rust appeared beneath the dirt. The iron pin was still there. Beside it sat an older metal marker, barely 3 inches above the ground, stamped C7. I wiped it clean and compared its position with my survey. It matched. I tied orange ribbon to a nearby branch and kept walking north. About 200 yards later, the woods opened unexpectedly. Gravel appeared beneath my boots. Then picnic tables, a stone fire pit, a wooden deck, and finally a cedar cabin with green shutters sitting between the trees as comfortably as if it had always belonged there. A carved sign beside the steps read Cedar Ridge Residents Only. I stood there for several seconds, listening to leaves scrape across the roof. My survey said I was still inside my property. I checked it again. Same result. A narrow trail continued past the cabin toward the lake, roughly where the easement was supposed to run, but the cabin itself sat well away from that path. I walked around the building without touching anything. Electrical service entered from the east. A gravel parking area held 6 spaces. Someone had recently stacked firewood beneath the deck. This was not an abandoned hunting shack. Somebody maintained it. I photographed the cabin, the sign, the trail, and the nearest visible landmarks, then started back toward my truck. I had made it maybe 50 yards when I heard tires approaching on the gravel. A white sport utility vehicle stopped behind my pickup. A blonde woman stepped out wearing a cream jacket and sunglasses. She looked at my survey, then at me. "Can I help you?" she asked. I folded the paper once. "I was about to ask you the same thing." She removed her sunglasses. "I am Diane Whitmore, president of the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association. That cabin is for residents only." I looked back through the trees at the cedar building. Then I looked down at the orange ribbon marking my boundary. "That might be a problem," I said, "because according to this survey, your residents-only cabin is sitting on my land." Diane stared at me for a moment, then gave the kind of smile people use when they believe the conversation has already been settled in their favor. "That is not possible," she said. "Cedar Ridge has owned this cabin for 17 years. I unfolded my survey again and held it where both of us could see it. "I am not asking who owns the building. I am asking who owns the ground under it." Her smile disappeared. Wind moved through the pines above us, carrying the dry smell of fallen leaves across the gravel. Diane stepped closer and pointed toward the narrow trail leading past the cabin. "The association has permanent access rights to this entire lakeside area. Do you have the recorded easement?" "Of course we do." "Good. Send me a copy." She looked at the orange ribbon I had tied near the old marker. "You should not be placing flags around HOA amenities. That marker was here before I was." Diane folded her arms. "Mr. Mercer, I think you are misunderstanding how this property works. Cedar Ridge residents have used that cabin since the development expanded into this section. The association paid for construction. We pay the insurance. We maintain the road, the deck, and the grounds." "None of that answers my question." Her expression hardened. "You closed on this property 3 days ago. We have been here for decades." That sentence stayed with me, not because it frightened me, but because it revealed how Diane thought. Time, in her mind, had become ownership. I gave her my email address and told her I would not interfere with the cabin until I reviewed the HOA documents. Then I drove home and spent Sunday night at my kitchen table with the deed, title policy, and survey spread around my laptop. Monday morning, Diane sent me 43 pages. Most were Cedar Ridge rules, insurance certificates, maintenance records, and board resolutions referring to the building as the Lakeside Community Cabin. Buried near the back was the easement. I printed it and read the legal description 3 times. The language granted Cedar Ridge residents pedestrian access from the subdivision to the lake across a narrow strip of land. It described a path 6 feet wide. Nothing in those pages transferred ownership of Tract C7. Nothing mentioned a cabin. Nothing authorized parking, a deck, a fire pit, or a gravel turnaround. I called a licensed surveyor named Nathan Brooks, a man I had worked with on grading projects for nearly 10 years. He met me at the property Wednesday morning, carrying a survey receiver and enough equipment to settle the question without anyone guessing. We started at the southern monument and worked north. The process took most of the day. By late afternoon, Nathan stood near the cabin, checking his receiver while I watched numbers settle on the screen. He walked to the nearest corner of the building, measured again, then looked toward me. "Caleb, this is not close." "How far?" He pointed toward the marked boundary behind us. "The nearest part of the cabin is 61 feet inside your property." I looked at the cedar siding, then at the narrow lakeside trail. The easement passed nearby exactly where the old description placed it. 6 feet wide. The cabin was nowhere near 6 feet wide. Nathan marked the verified boundary with orange flags and stakes. Before we finished, Diane's white sport utility vehicle appeared at the end of the gravel road. She got out, saw the new markers, and stopped. "What are you doing?" she demanded. Nathan calmly identified himself and explained that he had located the recorded boundary. Diane barely looked at him. Her attention stayed on me. "You had no authority to survey HOA property." I held up the copy of my deed. "I hired him to survey mine." She pointed toward the cabin. "That structure belongs to Cedar Ridge." "Then show me the deed for the land beneath it." Diane's face went still. "We have an easement." I nodded toward 2 orange stakes beside the trail. "Yes, 6 feet. Then I pointed toward the cabin. "Your building is 61 feet inside my boundary." For the first time since we met, Diane did not tell me I was mistaken. She reached for her phone instead. "Our attorney will contact you." The next morning, a certified letter arrived before 8. Cedar Ridge was no longer claiming the survey was wrong. They were claiming the survey did not matter. The letter came from Cedar Ridge attorney Martin Hale, and by the second paragraph, I understood their new strategy. They were no longer disputing Nathan's boundary work. Instead, they claimed 17 years of continuous use, maintenance, insurance payments, and community access had created enforceable property rights that prevented me from interfering with the cabin. The phrase they repeated was long-standing community use. I read the letter twice at the kitchen table while my coffee went cold beside me. Then I called Laura Mitchell, a property attorney recommended by one of my contractors. Her office overlooked the county courthouse. And when I met her that afternoon, she spent almost an hour reading before saying much of anything. She placed my deed on the left side of her desk, Nathan's certified survey in the middle, and Cedar Ridge's 6-foot pedestrian easement on the right. "They have a real easement," she said. "I know. That matters. But an easement is not automatically ownership of everything around it." She tapped the cabin location on Nathan's survey. "And this structure is nowhere near the described corridor." I asked the question that had been bothering me since the letter arrived. "Can using somebody else's land long enough make it yours?" Laura leaned back. "Under certain facts, property claims can become complicated. That is exactly why you do nothing to the cabin until we finish the title history." So I did nothing. I did not lock the building. I did not remove the sign. I did not block the trail. I did not interfere with residents using the recorded pedestrian easement. I documented everything and waited. Diane did not. 3 days later, Cedar Ridge held a Saturday gathering at the cabin. Cars filled the gravel turnaround. Folding tables appeared on the deck. When I drove past on my way to inspect the proposed workshop site, Diane stood beside the Cedar Ridge residents' only sign speaking with several homeowners. She saw my truck and gave me a small wave that felt less like a greeting than a message. On Monday, another notice arrived accusing me of intimidating residents by conducting surveys near an HOA amenity. On Tuesday, Cedar Ridge's attorney filed for temporary injunctive relief to prevent me from altering the cabin, restricting access, or disturbing what they described as the established recreational area while ownership rights were being litigated. That filing changed everything. My workshop plans overlapped the northern access road I intended to improve, and my lender did not like unresolved litigation attached to the property. A grading job I planned to start on my own land had to wait. Nathan's invoices arrived. Laura's retainer cleared my account. Every week of delay had a number attached to it. Diane had turned a boundary question into an expensive waiting game. At the preliminary hearing, the judge did not decide who owned the cabin. He ordered both sides to preserve the existing condition while the documents were reviewed. That meant Cedar Ridge could continue using the established access under the temporary order, and I could not remove or materially alter the structure. Diane walked out of the courthouse looking satisfied. On the sidewalk, she stopped beside me. "This could have been avoided if you had respected the community," she said. I looked at the courthouse doors behind her. "You asked a judge to stop me from touching a building 61 feet inside my property." And he did. She smiled and walked away. For about 10 seconds, I understood why she felt like she had won. Then Laura came through the doors carrying a thick folder. "Do not worry about the temporary order," she said. "It keeps everyone still while we find out what happened 17 years ago." 2 days later, she called me just after 6 in the evening. I was greasing a loader in my equipment yard when my phone rang. "Caleb, I found the original Cedar Ridge development plat." I wiped my hand on a shop rag. "And?" Papers moved on her end of the line. "Your survey is right. But there is something else. The HOA really was supposed to acquire Tract C7. I stopped moving. Supposed to. Laura paused. There is a difference between planning to buy land and actually buying it. I cannot find a recorded transfer. And I just found meeting minutes suggesting Cedar Ridge knew that before the cabin was built. Laura emailed the records before we ended the call, and I spent that night at my kitchen table reading 17-year-old HOA minutes while rain tapped against the windows. The first document was dated 6 months before construction of the cabin. Under new business, the Cedar Ridge Board discussed a proposed lakeside amenity and identified Tract C7 as the preferred location. The language sounded harmless until I reached one sentence. Acquisition of the Mercer Tract required owner approval before construction. I read it again. Owner approval. The next meeting referenced negotiations with the landowner. The meeting after that contained 4 words that changed the entire case. Acquisition postponed pending approval. Then the references stopped. No purchase price. No signed agreement. No recorded deed. Nothing showing Cedar Ridge ever acquired C7. Yet county permit records showed the cabin had been completed the following spring. Laura called at 8 the next morning. "We need the complete title chain," she said. "Meeting minutes help, but recorded documents decide ownership." Over the next 2 weeks, she traced every conveyance affecting my 38 acres while Nathan compared old plats against the modern survey. I kept expecting some forgotten deed to appear and prove Cedar Ridge had purchased the cabin site after all. It never did. Instead, the paper trail became cleaner. Tract C7 passed through 3 private owners before eventually becoming part of the parcel I bought. Every deed carried the same 6-foot pedestrian easement. None transferred the cabin footprint to Cedar Ridge. None expanded the easement. None granted parking rights or recreational use around the structure. On Friday afternoon, Laura spread the chain of title across her conference table. "They had permission to cross here," she said, tracing the narrow route toward the lake. Then she moved her fingers 61 feet across Nathan's survey and stopped on the cabin. "They built here." I stared at the distance between the 2 lines. That was the whole dispute reduced to 1 sheet of paper. A right to walk across 6 feet of land had somehow become a claim over an 1,100 square foot cabin, deck, fire pit, parking area, and surrounding ground. Cedar Ridge's attorney responded by arguing long-term use and investment. They produced maintenance invoices, insurance records, photographs of community events, and 17 years of HOA budgets listing the cabin as an association amenity. Laura did not dismiss any of it. She simply asked for the document that mattered most. Where was the deed? There was no answer. Then we found something newer. Laura had requested board records through discovery, including minutes from Diane's current term. One meeting from 14 months earlier contained a discussion labeled Lakeside Cabin. Title exposure. The board had been warned that the recorded easement might not include the cabin site. The minutes recommended obtaining a title opinion before making future improvements. At the bottom of the page was Diane Whitmore's signature approving the minutes. I felt the same cold stillness I had felt when Nathan told me the cabin was 61 feet inside my line. Diane had stood in front of me and acted as if my survey had invented a problem she had never heard about. But more than a year before I bought the property, She had signed a record acknowledging the title question herself. Does this prove she knew Cedar Ridge did not own it? I asked. Laura shook her head. Not by itself. It proves she knew there was an unresolved title issue. That is enough to make her certainty very difficult to explain. A week later, Diane sat across from us during a formal deposition, composed in a navy blazer with a bottle of water beside her. Her attorney reminded her to answer only what was asked. Laura began with the cabin. Who paid for it? Cedar Ridge. Who maintained it? Cedar Ridge. Who insured it? Cedar Ridge. Then Laura placed Nathan's survey on the table. Mrs. Whitmore, please identify the recorded instrument that transferred Tract C7 to the association. Diane looked down at the page. 5 seconds passed. Then 10. The association has long-standing rights to that property. Laura did not raise her voice. That was not my question. She slid the 17-year-old board minutes beside the survey, followed by the recent minutes bearing Diane's signature. Please show me the deed. Diane looked toward her attorney. For the first time since I had met her, there was no rule, notice, easement, or HOA policy ready to fill the silence. The deposition did not end the case, but it changed the way Cedar Ridge argued it. Martin Hale stopped calling Tract C7 association property in his letters. Now he called it land subject to historical community rights, which sounded impressive until Laura placed those rights beside the actual recorded easement. 6 feet. A pedestrian path to the lake. That was what Cedar Ridge had. Everything else depended on convincing a judge that 17 years of use had somehow created rights the recorded documents never granted. 3 weeks later, I sat beside Laura in county court with Nathan's certified survey, the complete title chain, the original development plat, and 2 sets of HOA meeting minutes arranged in folders in front of us. Diane sat across the aisle with Martin and 2 board members. She never looked at me. The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and paper, and every small sound seemed louder than it should have been. The judge spent nearly an hour asking questions about dates, boundaries, easement language, construction records, and ownership history. Martin emphasized that Cedar Ridge had built the cabin, insured it, maintained it, and treated it as a community amenity for 17 years. The judge listened without interrupting. Then he looked at Nathan's survey. Where is the cabin in relation to the recorded pedestrian easement? Nathan answered from the witness chair. The nearest portion of the structure is approximately 61 feet inside Mr. Mercer's property and outside the 6-foot easement corridor. Martin argued that the association's long-standing use extended beyond the written description. Laura responded with the old board minutes. Cedar Ridge had known before construction that Tract C7 required acquisition from the owner. The planned acquisition had been postponed. No recorded transfer followed. Then she presented the recent minutes bearing Diane's signature, showing the current board had already been warned about unresolved title exposure before I ever bought the property. The judge turned toward Martin. Counsel, show me the instrument conveying Tract C7 to the association. Martin opened a binder. He turned several pages, paused, then referenced the easement again. The judge shook his head slightly. I understand the easement. I am asking for the conveyance. The room became so quiet I could hear the ventilation system above us. Martin finally said, Your Honor, there is no separate recorded deed in the association's records. That sentence did more than any argument I could have made. The judge looked down at the documents for several seconds. When he spoke again, his voice remained calm. He ruled that Cedar Ridge had established its recorded pedestrian access rights, but had not established ownership of Tract C7 or a property right covering the cabin footprint. The temporary restriction preventing me from altering the structure would be lifted after the order became effective, subject to ordinary county permitting and any applicable utility or environmental requirements. Diane leaned toward Martin immediately. That cannot be right, she said, loud enough for several people to hear. The judge looked up. Diane continued, more controlled now. Our homeowners have paid for that cabin for 17 years. It is part of this community. The judge did not argue with her. Payment for maintenance is not a recorded conveyance of land, Mrs. Whitmore. Diane's face tightened. So he can simply remove something our residents built and paid for. The judge glanced toward the survey. What Mr. Mercer may lawfully do with improvements located on his property is governed by the order and applicable law. The association's access easement remains protected. I did not smile. I did not look at Diane. I looked at the orange survey line highlighted on Nathan's map and thought about the old iron marker buried under pine needles. See, 7 had been telling the truth the entire time. Outside the courthouse, Laura handed me a copy of the ruling. You won the ownership question, she said. Now do not get careless. I knew exactly what she meant. A court ruling was not a demolition permit. The next morning, instead of starting my excavator, I walked into the county building department carrying a folder. If Cedar Ridge had spent 17 years confusing permission with ownership, I was going to make sure every step I took from that point forward was something Diane could not confuse with anything. The woman behind the county building counter looked at the court order, then at me, then back at the order. You are not in a hurry, are you? She asked. I have been waiting for months, I said. I can wait long enough to do it correctly. That answer seemed to satisfy her. She gave me the demolition application, a utility clearance checklist, disposal requirements, and a site protection form because the cabin sat near a drainage area feeding the lake. None of it was dramatic. That was exactly what I wanted. Over the next 12 days, I treated the cabin like any other structure my company would remove. The electric service was disconnected and documented. A county inspector verified there were no active utility connections. I hired an environmental contractor to check the older building materials before disposal. Nathan returned to mark the 6-foot pedestrian easement with bright orange stakes so no equipment would cross it. I even adjusted the equipment route to approach from the west, adding nearly 200 feet of travel just to keep Cedar Ridge's legal access untouched. Every receipt went into a folder. Every inspection received a copy. Every boundary marker was photographed. Diane kept watching. The first email arrived 2 days after the ruling. She asked whether I intended to preserve the cabin for community use. I answered through Laura. The second email proposed that Cedar Ridge lease the ground beneath the structure. I declined. Then came an offer to purchase a small section of C7. I considered it for less than a minute. The cabin sat exactly where I planned to improve drainage and create safe access to the northern portion of my property. More importantly, I had spent months being told that a recorded boundary did not matter because Cedar Ridge had grown comfortable ignoring it. I was not interested in selling them a solution to a problem they had refused to acknowledge. Still, I did not interfere with the lake trail. Residents continued walking between the orange stakes. Some avoided looking at me. Others stopped to ask what would happen. I told them the truth. The trail stays. The easement is valid. One older man named Frank looked surprised. Diane said you were closing the lake access. I never said that. He stared at the 6-foot corridor, then toward the cabin. So this was only about the building? It was about the difference between what the HOA owns and what it is allowed to use. Frank nodded slowly and kept walking. That conversation told me how Cedar Ridge had been framing the dispute inside the neighborhood. By the end of the second week, the county approved my demolition permit. The paper was almost disappointing to look at. White sheet. Black print. Red approval stamp. After 4 months of letters, hearings, invoices, and legal arguments, permission arrived on something that could fit inside a glove compartment. Laura reviewed it before I scheduled anything. Keep the court order with you, she said. Keep the survey with you. If Diane calls law enforcement, stay calm and let the documents speak. I scheduled the work for the following Tuesday at 8 in the morning. Monday evening, I drove to the property alone. Sunset reflected orange across the lake while wind moved softly through the pines. I walked past the iron C7 marker and followed the boundary toward the cabin. The Cedar Ridge residents' only sign still stood beside the steps. 17 years of weather had faded the lettering around the edges. I thought about removing it then, but left it exactly where it was. Tomorrow, everything would happen in the proper order. At 7:38 the next morning, I unloaded my excavator on the western access route. At 7:46, Nathan checked the easement stakes one final time. At 7:52, the county inspector arrived. At 7:57, a white sport utility vehicle came quickly down the gravel road. Diane stepped out before it had been parked for more than a few seconds. She saw the excavator, saw the permit folder on the hood of my truck, and immediately raised her phone. Caleb, do not move that machine. I looked at the clock on the dashboard. 8 o'clock. For months had brought us back to the exact morning where this story began. Diane crossed the gravel before I could climb into the excavator. I said, do not move that machine. Her voice carried through the quiet trees, sharp enough that Nathan looked up from the easement stakes. I closed the cab door again and stepped down. "Good morning, Diane." She held her phone in one hand and pointed toward the cabin with the other. "Our attorney is reviewing an emergency filing. If you touch that structure before he finishes, you could be creating another legal problem." I walked to my pickup and opened the permit folder on the hood. Here is the court order. Here is the demolition permit. Here is the utility clearance. Here is the environmental inspection. "Nathan marked your easement yesterday." Diane barely looked at the papers. "Cedar Ridge still owns the cabin. The judge already ruled on the property rights. The association paid for that building." "I know. Our residents maintained it for 17 years. "I know that too." She stared at me, frustrated by the fact that I was not arguing with facts that did not change the boundary. A few minutes later, a county deputy arrived. Diane had called before reaching the property. Deputy Harris listened while she explained that I was preparing to destroy an HOA amenity despite an active easement. When she finished, he turned to me. I handed him the same folder. He read the court order first, then the permit, then looked toward the orange stakes running beside the trail. "That is the easement?" he asked. Nathan nodded. 6 feet wide, surveyed and marked. "The equipment route stays completely west of it." The county inspector confirmed the permit was active and the utilities had been cleared. Diane's attorney arrived shortly afterward, stepped out of his car, and immediately asked to see my paperwork. Martin read the court order in silence. Then he pulled Diane several yards away. I could not hear everything they said, but I heard enough. "The order is clear," Martin told her. Diane answered, "There has to be something we can do." Martin lowered his voice. "Not here. Not this morning." When they returned, Diane looked at me differently. The certainty was gone, replaced by something more personal. "You are really going to remove it?" I looked toward the cabin. Morning light touched the green shutters and the faded Cedar Ridge residence only sign beside the steps. I gave the association opportunities to resolve this before court. "You could sell us the land now." "I could." "Then why will you not?" I looked toward the drainage swale beyond the cabin, then toward the northern access route I had been unable to improve for months. "Because I have plans for my property. The same reason Cedar Ridge wanted this spot 17 years ago." She shook her head. "People have birthdays there. Holiday gatherings. Families have used that deck for years." For the first time, she sounded less like an HOA president and more like someone realizing a familiar place was about to change. I understood that. None of those residents had created the title problem. "The lake trail stays open," I said. "The easement stays exactly as recorded." Diane looked toward the orange stakes. "That is not the same." "No, it is what Cedar Ridge actually has." Deputy Harris stepped back toward his vehicle. Martin closed his briefcase. The inspector gave me a short nod. There was nothing left to debate beside the road. I climbed into the excavator and started the engine. Diesel settled into a steady rumble beneath me. Through the windshield, I could see the old iron C7 marker near the trees, the 6-foot easement safely outside my work route, and Diane standing beside her attorney. I moved the machine forward slowly and positioned the bucket beside the cabin. 12 inches. The same distance where I had stopped at the beginning of that morning. I paused one final time, not because Diane had authority to stop me, but because after 4 months I wanted to be certain every person, every document, and every boundary was exactly where it belonged. Then I lowered the bucket toward the first section scheduled for controlled removal. The first thing I removed was not the cabin. It was the Cedar Ridge residence only sign. I shut down the excavator, climbed out, and walked over to it while Diane watched from beside Martin's car. The cedar post had been in the ground long enough for moss to grow around its base. I loosened it carefully, lifted the sign free, and placed it beside my pickup instead of throwing it into the disposal pile. Then I returned to the machine. The removal itself took most of the day because I had no interest in turning 17 years of somebody else's mistake into a careless mess. We worked section by section. Reusable materials were separated. Debris went into approved containers. Nathan checked the easement markers. Whenever equipment moved near the northern edge of the work area, the county inspector returned twice before noon. The 6-foot trail to the lake remained open the entire time. By late afternoon, the cabin was gone, but the orange stakes were still standing exactly where they had been that morning. Diane left before lunch. Martin stayed another hour, mostly watching, then drove away without saying anything. What surprised me was how many Cedar Ridge residents came down the trail afterward. Some looked angry. Some looked confused. Most simply stopped when they saw the open ground where the cabin had stood. Frank, the older homeowner I had spoken with before, found me near the excavator while I was checking the final load. "You really kept the trail?" he said. "I told you I would." He looked toward the lake. Diane made it sound like we were losing access to everything. I pointed toward the orange markers. "Those 6 feet belong to your easement. Nobody is taking them away." Frank nodded, then looked at the empty cabin site. "And that part? That is C7. Over the next month, I corrected the drainage problem behind the old cabin site and improved my northern equipment access without crossing the pedestrian corridor. The lawsuit was closed. Cedar Ridge did not appeal the ownership ruling. At the next HOA election, Diane lost the presidency. I heard that from Frank, not from her. The new board sent Laura a letter acknowledging the recorded boundaries and asking to establish a simple maintenance agreement for the lake trail. I agreed, as long as the language matched the deed. 6 feet meant 6 feet. Access meant access. Ownership meant ownership. By spring, my 40 by 60-foot workshop was framed on the southern portion of the property, exactly where I had planned it before any of this started. I mounted the certified survey inside my office, not because I needed a trophy, but because I had paid enough legal fees to appreciate a good piece of paper. Beside it, I hung the old Cedar Ridge residence only sign. I left the faded lettering exactly as it was. Underneath, on a small shelf, sat a replica of the iron C7 marker I had found beneath the pine needles during my first walk across the property. Sometimes people who visited the shop asked why I kept an HOA sign on my wall when I did not belong to an HOA. I would tell them it reminded me of something my grandfather understood without ever needing a courtroom to explain it. A fence can move. A sign can lie. People can repeat the same claim for 17 years until everyone around them accepts it as fact. But land records do not care who sounds confident. Diane believed time had transformed permission into ownership. Cedar Ridge had maintained the cabin, insured it, held birthdays there, and printed it on community maps. None of those things changed the deed beneath the floorboards. The judge did not need anger to settle that question. He needed a survey, a title chain, and one missing document that Cedar Ridge could never produce. 17 years made the cabin old. It never made my land theirs.